Well, welcome everyone. I'm Aleinikoff, the Dean at the New School for Social Research, and today we're launching a new initiative at NSSR. We're calling it NSSR Insights, and it'll feature a regular set of talks by our NSSR alums and occasionally NSSR faculty for NSSR alums and other New York and other New School alumni
Mario
as
Ernesto
well.
Perez Pinto, WhatsApp audio.
Maybe people can mute if they're listening here. We're delighted to have as our kickoff speaker Patrick Clawson, who graduated from NSSR in 1978 with a PhD in economics. Patrick is currently the Morningstar Senior Fellow and Research Counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he directs the Viterbi Program on Iran and U.S. policy. And that should be evident. The conversation today really could not be more timely, and there could be no person more expert on this topic than Patrick. He's authored more than 150 articles about the Middle East and international economics, and is the author or editor of 18 books or studies on Iran. Patrick regularly appears on television and radio and has published op-ed articles in major newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. And he's testified in front of congressional committees and also served as an expert witness in more than 30 federal cases against Iran. Patrick, it's so nice to be speaking to you today, and how timely that you're here. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with some questions. I should say to folks listening, if you have some questions, you can post them in the Q&A, and we may have some time at the end to get to them. Well, what lies ahead in the Middle East, particularly as regards Israel's actions in Lebanon and its likely response to Iran?
Well, Israel sees both an opportunity and a necessity to retaliate against Iran for the October 1st missile attacks that the Iranians directed at Israel. The opportunity comes from the damage done to Hezbollah, and that for a long time, Israel was concerned that if they were to take action against Iran, that Hezbollah would let loose some of the many thousands of rockets that it has and inflict heavy damage on critical Israeli infrastructure and Israeli cities. Well, now Israel says that Hezbollah has lost fully half of its missiles, and besides which, its leadership, including its military leadership, are in disarray. So Israel's much less concerned about how Hezbollah would react. That's the opportunity. Then there's the necessity. Israel feels that it made a mistake by listening to Biden's advice after the April 13th Iranian attack. Biden said, take the win. And the Israelis, therefore, did a relatively small retaliation against Iran, and they kept their mouth about it. They didn't publicize it. Now the Israelis feel that made the Iranians think that their April 13th attack had actually been pretty successful. And so, therefore, Iran engaged in the October 1st attack against Israel. So Israel thinks that it needs to show that there's a heavier price to be paid, or Iran might be tempted to engage in another attack against Israel. So yes, there's going to be an Israeli retaliation. Now, we know Washington Post ran a long article about it today, that Biden asked Netanyahu not to hit nuclear facilities, not to hit oil facilities, and that Netanyahu agreed that and said that Israel would hit military infrastructure. Well, that's a pretty broad term. It covers a whole lot of things. Some U.S. officials have urged Israel to hit Iranian missile production facilities, saying that not only would that help Israel, but it would also reduce what Iran can do to provide Russia with missiles that it can use against Ukraine. And that's something that the Europeans and the Americans would be grateful to see. But we'll see. I don't know what Israel's going to hit, but I do think that there's going to be some hit between now and the elections. And then after the operation against Hezbollah finishes, which Israel keeps saying will be within a few weeks, then there may be more.
After the last rounds of attacks, the Iranian missiles, and then the fairly limited Israeli response, people sort of thought things were done. What's your sense here? If Israel launches a major attack to try to deter future Iranian attacks, does that force Iran to have to respond again, or can this be the end of it?
Iran will probably respond, hopefully in a relatively symbolic way, but actually not necessarily. The Iranians may just simply say that the Israelis didn't inflict any damage, no big deal, and say, well, that's the end of it. A large war? I don't think so. Iran has for a long time relied on Hezbollah as being an important instrument to use against Israel. And frankly, Hezbollah is not in great shape to be used against Israel at the moment.
So there's been, let me ask you, the reporting today in the Washington Post, a story like that comes out. You've been in Washington a long time. You know these actors. How does a story like that get into the Post? Who leaks it and why?
Well, almost certainly somebody from the administration who wants to calms down nervous oil markets and who frankly would rather turn the conversation away to some other subject. There's an election campaign on, and this is an issue is not seen by the Harris campaign as a winner. So they'd rather turn things to other issues. And so almost certainly, given the number of administration officials who were quoted by the reporter, this was orchestrated by the administration.
It's been reported that Biden has repeatedly sought to limit Netanyahu in some way, at least in the Gaza and perhaps in the Gaza war, but also perhaps in Lebanon, and also been reported that he's been pretty unsuccessful. What's your sense of the success of the Biden administration in accomplishing U.S. government goals, or the overall influence the U.S. government really has in the region today?
Throughout the Middle East, not just in Israel, but also in other U.S. allies and in countries hostile to the United States, the perception is that the United States is leading and losing. So that the United States is leaving the region and that the United States is no longer particularly effective at accomplishing things. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq, and there's a sense in the region that the U.S. method of war has not turned out to be very successful. Now, a lot of that impression is greatly exaggerated. The U.S. continues to have 40,000 soldiers in the region. But once the perception spreads that the U.S. is leaving and losing, really dramatically undercuts what the U.S. can accomplish in the area and how much people pay attention to what the U.S. is saying.
Well, what options does the U.S. government have really for influencing Israel and Iran as well?
It's pretty tough. I mean, there was a time 30, 40 years ago when Israel was heavily dependent upon aid from the United States, whereas now the financial impact of that aid is relatively limited. It's less than 1% of Israel's GDP. Israel now has a $500 billion economy. And so the U.S. leverage with the Israeli government is also limited by the divisive nature of Israeli politics, where, frankly, a lot of people in Mr. Netanyahu's electoral base are quite happy when Mr. Netanyahu implies that Mr. Biden can take a hike. The Biden administration, and particularly President Biden, have taken the attitude that they can influence Israel through quiet conversations. And they've had some success, so that, for instance, the humanitarian situation in Gaza dramatically improved this spring as a result of a whole series of steps that the Israelis took after months of U.S. badgering. Unfortunately, that humanitarian situation has deteriorated dramatically since the Israeli action in Rafah, the so-called Philadelphia corridor with Egypt. And the humanitarian situation in Gaza, which was sharply improving through the early summer, is now sharply deteriorating. And we're going to need to see some tough words, and we're seeing some tough words from the administration to the Israelis is saying, look, you got to take new actions in order to get humanitarian supplies in. There's also been a real change in how the goods get into Gaza, in that now, in many ways, the most important way in which goods get in is that they're trucked in from Jordan by the Jordanian armed forces. And then the distribution in Gaza is done through commercial channels and not through aid channels. So aid organizations are saying, oh, there's no aid coming in, there's no aid coming in. Yeah, okay, but there's frankly quite a bit of goods coming in that are being sold.
And what's your sense of what the U.S. Influence has been in terms of Israeli actions in Lebanon?
Well, the United States has not particularly discouraged the Israelis after the United States tried very hard to arrange a restoration of order in southern Lebanon, in which Hezbollah would not be attacking Israel, and Israel would not be attacking Hezbollah. And so the U.S. and the French put a lot of effort to trying to arrange a so-called ceasefire. That didn't work. And then and the Israelis moved in, and initially the U.S. was quite unhappy about that. But since the Israeli assault began, the U.S. has generally been kind of surprised at how successful the Israelis have been and how little resistance they faced from Hezbollah. And the Israelis have been remarkably successful with some of the things they've done. I mean, that attack on the pagers and walkie-talkies looked like it came from a Mission Impossible movie. It was quite something. And then the attack on the bunker in which Nasrallah was hiding, and the one where his likely successor was hiding, which again, it was really impressive that the Israelis knew that the Hezbollah leaders were in those bunkers, and then it was really impressive the way they went after those very deeply buried bunkers. Frankly, the U.S. military had been highly skeptical that Israel could carry something like that out. So right now, the U.S. government is not particularly leaning on the Israelis to do that much about their incursion into Lebanon. But the Israeli, besides saying, bring it to an end soon and don't go too far.
And they don't think things have gone too far. The number of casualties in Lebanon now are maybe 2,000 people dead. People were killed by those handheld devices who were obviously not Hezbollah participants. And do you think the U.S. has expressed any concern about that?
Well, the U.S. certainly continues to say to the Israelis, you could have another commie movement. There was an Israeli attack during the 2006 war on what turned out to be a large number of civilians who were taking shelter in a place called Kani. And this large-scale slaughter led to a lot of reaction against the Israelis, and the Israelis had to bring their operation to a quick close. The U.S. government is warning the Israelis, don't overreach, don't realize that there could always be some kind of large-scale casualty event that makes it necessary for us to take a strong action against you. But on the whole, the U.S. government is aware that what the Israeli objective is to create circumstances under which the 60 to 80,000 Israelis who left the area along the north can return to their homes, and that Israel's going to be pretty relentless about pursuing that objective of getting people back into their homes.
One other question on influence on Israel here. Now, 2 European countries at least have said they're not going to send offensive, I think, weapons to Israel. What do you think leaving aside whether politically the U.S. would do it, would a decision by the U.S. to stop sending bombs and other armaments, do you think materially influence Israeli behavior?
Well, the big question would be which arms, which armaments, and for how long. And I would say that it's unlikely in the extreme that the United States would cease all arms sales to Israel for a sustained period of time. And the Israelis are well aware of that. But there are lots of things you can do about just how open is the spigot. So what kind of advanced weapon systems do the Israelis have access to? The United States has several times during the course of the last year, limited Israel's access to large bombs, saying, look, you ought to use more precision weapons for urban warfare. But that's kind of hard to do right at the moment because the Israelis, after all, so successfully used large bombs to take out Nasrallah.
Okay, now switching to Iran, and same sort of questions about what kind of influence you think that the U.S. Has with Iran. Of course, they've gone back and forth on the Israel having deals with Iran to try to prevent their nuclear industry from developing. And there was an election of what was reputed to be a more moderate Iranian president, 6 months ago or so. How are you assessing developments in Iran and U.S. relationship with Iran?
Well, Iran's supreme leader, who's the ultimate decision maker on all foreign affairs issues, is a pretty cautious guy. He wants to die in his bed. And so for a long time, he is frankly restrained some of those in Iran who wanted to be bolder in their actions against U.S. interests. And this new Iranian president, very clearly, when he was in New York for the UN General Assembly meetings, brought along a team of people to say, hey, let's restart negotiations, let's put relations with the West on a different basis. And they were advising that after the Israelis killed Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, that Iran not respond vigorously. Well, there was an active debate in Iran about what to do, and they clearly lost. And the people in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, are the ones who won out. And that's why they carried out the actions they did. And in Iran, those missile strikes are seen as a great success. We here emphasize that, well, lots of the missiles didn't get through. The Iranians emphasize, well, some did. And this shows that Iran can hit Israel. So I would say that at the moment, those in the Revolutionary Guard Corps would be saying that resistance is the way to go, have the upper hand. You're mute.
You're correct. Thanks. There was the siren here that I was blocking out. What kinds of back channel conversations occur between the U.S. And Iran through intermediaries, or do you think there really is very little communication at this point?
Well, the United States and Iran exchange a lot of notes, particularly via the Swiss, who represent U.S. interests in Iran. The Swiss ambassador to Iran, the Swiss in general, have said that more than 20% of all relationships between Switzerland and the United States are concerned in that relationship of Switzerland representing U.S. interests in Iran. But in addition, there are a variety of actors who step forward at different times to serve as intermediaries. Most recently, the Omanis, who've played that role at times in the past. But it would appear that at the moment, there are no active discussions going on via the Omanis. There are a lot of people, both in the United States and around the world, who keep careful tabs of which Iranian officials and which U.S. officials are going to Iran. And there haven't been those kind of trips for the last couple of months.
Patrick, you mentioned we're in the middle of an election campaign here, as all are well aware. How much difference has it made for U.S. policy in the Middle East with changing presidents? So, as in the time that you've been watching the region, and what lessons do those experiences hold for whether we end up with Trump or Harris here?
Well, the last 6 U.S. presidents have come into office convinced that they can handle things in the Middle East much better than their predecessors, because their predecessors had ideological blinders. So whether it's George Bush convinced that he will not do the kind of Iran-Contra deal that Mr. Reagan did, or whether it's Mr. Clinton convinced that if Bush had spoken more clearly to Saddam, that Saddam would not have felt he could invade Kuwait, or whether it's, of course, and George W. Bush coming into office saying that Clinton had gotten snookered into spending too much time in the Arab-Israeli peace negotiations. And he had to get back to the main issue, which is great power relations. And then Obama convinced that Bush had totally messed up in Iraq. And Trump coming in convinced that Obama had been blindsided by the Iranians in the nuclear deal with Iran, known as the JCPOA, or whether it's Biden convinced that Trump had messed things up by walking out of the JCPOA. So we've had a long history of presidents being convinced, I can do better, the previous guy messed up. And I frankly suspect that's going to be the case this time around too, that the new team is going to think they can do better. The Middle East is not going to be the priority for either Harris or Trump, but I think both of them feel that they can do better than the previous team.
So what have their campaigns said about how they would do better?
Well, frankly, the campaigns would rather not discuss this sort of thing. So we saw during the vice presidential debate, I think that was the very first debate for the president or vice president, where the opening question was about the Middle East, right? And both Mr. Waltz and Mr. Vance proceeded to evade the question. And I think that reflects well the attitude that campaigns have about the Middle East. They'd rather change the topic, thank you. Neither one of them has a good idea of what to do about Iran's nuclear program. Neither one of them has a good idea what to do about the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon. And so they'd rather not talk about it.
Well, if Trump is elected, what do you think we'd see? Much of a change in the current U.S. government policies? What would your prediction be?
Well, Mr. Trump will be convinced that is convinced that the Biden team completely messed up the approach to Iran, and that he'll have a new approach to Iran that will work much better. Frankly, that's his priority, not fixing U.S. relations with Iran, but instead showing that Biden got it wrong. That was the same thing that we saw with the first Trump administration, is that Trump's priority regarding Iran was to show that Obama had been wrong. It wasn't to fix things regarding Iran. And so I would assume that a new Trump administration would want to show that greater pressure on Iran will accomplish much. Well, maybe, but frankly, there's a distinct possibility that greater pressure on Iran will have the same results as the last time, namely not much. And if Harris comes in, I suspect Harris will sustain, as Biden has sustained all of the sanctions that Trump put on Iran, all of them. And that, I think, surprised the Iranians and surprised a lot of people that for all the talk about how Biden was going to be so different from Trump, he kept every single solitary sanction on Iran. And I think that Harris would do that too.
What would greater pressure on Iran look like if the Trump administration were serious about that?
Well, the Iranians at one point in the start of the great pressure campaign by the Trump administration had to reduce their oil exports to a mere 400,000 barrels a day. Well, it's back up to 1.4 million barrels a day, and that's a lot more money for the Iranian government. And I think the Trump administration would devote quite a bit of effort to trying to enforce those sanctions. Just the other day, the Treasury and State announced a variety of new sanctions on Iranian oil sales. Frankly, that's not the main thing. The main thing is enforcing the existing sanctions. And that's going to be very difficult to do because the world has moved on, and oil exporters, especially Russia, but also Iran, have figured out ways to get around the U.S. sanctions. And so it's going to be really tough to reduce Iran's oil sales back to anything like the level they were at in the early Trump days.
So what I'm hearing you say is the U.S. is either not so inclined to put more pressure on Israel or doesn't really have the power, the political will to do so, and that there's not much more it can do vis-a-vis Iran in terms of sanctions. So are you describing really a situation where influence has ebbed significantly in the region for the United States?
Well, as I said, the perception in the region is the United States is leading and losing, and so why pay attention to the U.S.?
Yeah.
And I think that it's going to be a real struggle for the United States to have anything like the kind of influence it once did have. Only a little perspective on this is useful. I mean, before the U.S. Sent all those troops to Saudi Arabia to liberate Kuwait back in '91, the United States was not that big an actor in the Middle East. And the period from '91 until sort of 2015 or so, when the U.S. had such a major presence in the Middle East, then it's been more of the exception rather than the rule. And I think that we're returning back to that rule where the United States is an important player, but it's certainly not calling the shots.
It's been suggested that the Hamas atrocity in Israel on October 7th was undertaken in part to upset the current negotiations with Saudi Arabia and reaching some kind of arrangement with Israel that would push, I guess, the Abraham Accords forward. First of all, do you think that's right? And secondly, do you think if things, some kind of ceasefire or some kind of stopping of hostilities occurs in Gaza, that those talks can be put back on track?
Well, Hamas's concern was that the Palestinian issue was disappearing off the world agenda. And this potential normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel was certainly a sign of that. But more generally, they thought that the world was forgetting about the Palestinians, and they wanted to put the Palestinian issue back front and center in world politics. And they've had considerable success in doing that. Now, the Saudi-Israeli normalization was always seen by the Saudis as, in no small part, a Saudi-U.S. improvement in relations. And the Saudis wanted from the United States a formal defense treaty, and they wanted an agreement that the United States would help Saudi Arabia develop nuclear power. Those are going to be tough to get. The United States Senate has approved, 8 treaties in the last 5 years. They don't approve many treaties. And a defense relationship with Saudi Arabia would be highly controversial, with many people who still remember the killing of Mr. Khashoggi and other Saudi human rights abuses. So it was going to be difficult to get that Saudi-Israeli normalization, because it was going to be very difficult for the United States to deliver on what the Saudis were insisting on. And of course, it was going to be very difficult to get Israel to deliver on what the Saudis wanted, which is to say an Israeli commitment to a 2-state solution, even if it's in the long term. Because for his own domestic political situation, Mr. Netanyahu has a lot of problems making any kind of promise about a 2-state solution, even if he's talking about something in the long distant future.
Can you say a bit about the Saudi Iranian relationship and how that plays into the Saudi approach to Gaza?
Well, they hate each other, and any kind of rapprochement is going to be on a purely transactional basis. So, for instance, every year on the Hajj, there's some 80,000 Iranians who come to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj. That's important for the clerical establishment in Iran. And it's important for the Saudis to demonstrate that they really are the leader of the Muslim world. And the Saudis were shocked at how successful the Iranians were in the 2019 attack on what is arguably the single most important oil facility in the world, namely Saudi Aramco's oil separation facility at Al-Kate. A huge thing. I mean, it's the size of several football fields, and the Iranian attack with drones and cruise missiles was remarkably accurate. So the Saudis have concluded that, well, while they hate the Iranians, that they have to learn how to live with them. And it's not going to be easy. I mean, the Iranians, after all, it's only now some 6 years ago that the Iranian mob stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran and burned it down. And deeply upset the Saudis. So this is not a friendship, but this is, if I say, a transactional relationship.
So in earlier generations, there was a sense that Israel was alone amidst its Arab and Muslim neighbors. What you're describing now really is a split. And I guess it could be put in terms of Shia and Sunni terms or other ways of dividing it, but that there really is not this uniform Arab/Muslim alliance now vis-a-vis Israel.
And there's a lot of countries in the Middle East, a lot of leaders in the Middle East who don't like the Israelis, wish that it wasn't there, but recognize that it's going to be there for the indefinite future. And so therefore, we've now had 40 years of Israeli-Egyptian peace and 30 years of Israeli-Jordanian peace. And the working relationships between the security establishments of those three countries is really quite good. And so even while there's lots of political disagreements, and I say they don't particularly like each other, the security establishments get along quite well.
Do you see any likelihood of any change in Iranian policy towards Israel, or is sort of obliterate Israel likely to be state doctrine for some time?
Well, we don't know what's going to happen when the supreme leader dies, because the supreme leader is really a micromanager, and he's concentrated all power in his hands. And you could have the kind of post-Stalin scenario in which the new government that comes in keeps up the general orientation of the previous government, but makes some significant changes. That's a possibility. I don't think it's the most likely possibility, because in fact, the Revolutionary Guards were almost certainly going to have the main say in who's Khomeini's successor. The Revolutionary Guards, if anything, is more ideological and more committed to the revolutionary goals, including the elimination of Israel, than even Mr. Khomeini. But there's going to be a big change after Khomeini leaves, that's for sure. Until he leaves, don't expect any sign to change like that.
Just want to remind people listening that if you want to put some questions in the Q&A, I can ask some of those, but I've got a whole bunch more here, and I'll just happy to keep going. Obviously one of the major, if not the major, Israeli objective is to stop the Iranians from developing a nuclear weapon, which is also, I think, obviously a U.S. goal as well. How do you assess the success of the United States of achieving that goal? And if it hasn't been very successful, if you were working now at the National Security Council, what would be your advice on what policies the U.S. should be adopting?
Well, the United States and the world community has been quite successful for delaying the Iranian program. It's been underway for better than 20 years, and Iran still doesn't have a nuclear weapon, which is in some ways quite a success. But Iran is quite close to having a nuclear weapon. And there is the distinct possibility that Iran will, in the not too distant future, have a clandestine nuclear program, similar to what Israel had throughout the 1970s, 1980s, where everybody thought Israel had a nuclear weapon, but you couldn't actually prove it. Well, the fact is that the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors say that they have less and less access to Iranian sites and less confidence they know that what Iran is up to. And what they do know that Iran is up to is quite disturbing, because it suggests that Iran's gotten quite a lot of the fissile material it needs for weapons. And if we go back and take a look at how long it takes to turn a fissile material into a weapon, well, it may take several months to a year, as U.S. officials like to say. But in 1945, it took the United States 9 days, the time it had fissile material, until it had a bomb. 9 days. I don't think Iran's going to be that fast, but it could be a whole lot faster than this several months to a year.
So then my second part of that question is what action should the U.S. be taking if one of its major goals is to prevent the development of that weapon?
A fair amount of what the U.S. has to do now is to indicate to the Iranians, you really don't want that weapon. It's going to cause you a lot of trouble. You're going to get into a lot of difficulties with countries, all kinds of countries around the world. And by the way, since the Israelis have shown that they're really good at penetrating Hezbollah and at penetrating you and assassinating your nuclear scientists, can you be confident that that weapon system will ever actually work? Can you be confident that the Israelis won't have found a way to sabotage it? Well, why the heck should you try and do that? And there are some voices in Iran who agree with that, who say that Iran's having a lot of success with its missile programs, and that its missile programs now seem to offer another way in order to inflict unacceptable damage on Israel in a way that won't cause as much backlash against Iran as with nuclear weapons. And so that there are some voices in Iran suggesting it. That's really where Iran should be putting its effort and energy is on its missile program, not on its nuclear program. And there are some voices in the U.S. military who are saying the same thing. We at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy published a study by a previous commander at CENTCOM in which he said that, look, it's the Iranian missile threat, which is keeps me up at night, not the Iranian nuclear threat. And that because of the Iranian missiles and ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, the United States cannot be certain that it has air superiority if there were a confrontation with Iran. And that's the first time in 70 years that the U.S. can't be sure that they would have air superiority in a conflict. So the message that I think the United States has to pass to Iran is saying, why exactly do you want to do this? Is this really the route you want to take? Which isn't a particularly encouraging message because it suggests to the Iranians, oh, by the way, you're having a lot of success with your missiles and drones.
But how would the world know if Iran actually had developed a nuclear weapon if Iran didn't announce it?
I suspect that, in fact, that the world would learn the same way the world learned that Israel had a nuclear weapon, which is to say, U.S. intelligence would leak it. And that, in fact, in many ways, a judgment by U.S. intelligence that Iran has developed a nuclear weapon would have more credibility than an Iranian announcement that they had developed a nuclear weapon, short of a test. And so far, the Iranians don't seem to be interested in going the route of North Korea of conducting a test to say, folks, we got this nuclear weapon. And because if Iran does that, then they risk having the same pariah status as North Korea.
So let's focus a little bit on the human rights situation here. What's been happening to the human rights and the democratic forces in the Middle East? I guess it's sort of a two-part question, I suppose, because we did have the Arab Spring several years ago, which seemed to have faded. And there was a massive set of protests in the name of democracy against Netanyahu just before October 7th. And since then, there's been massive condemnation of human rights violations, primarily by Israel and also by Hamas in what's happened. Where are these arguments these days? Is the war simply pushed them to the side?
Well, the sad reality is that over the last 15 years, governments in the Middle East have gotten to be pretty darn good about figuring out how to derail and respond to protests. And so whether you take a government like the Algerian government, which faced a large-scale protest movement now some 5 years ago, totally gone, or the Tunisian government, which at one point looked like it was the one that was going to be the most democratic in the area, again, totally gone. The Tunisian president just got reelected in a sham election the other day. And so part of what's happened is that there are a lot of people in the Middle East who decided that while they dislike the authoritarian governments, they dislike even more the mess that will happen if you try and overthrow them. So whether it's the Syrian civil war or the continuing conflict in Libya, those are not exactly models that other people want to emulate. And so there are a lot of people who feel that protest movements could be pretty dangerous for human rights, even if they're successful. I can't say that there are that active protest movements in many countries. Iran has more protest movements than many countries, but even there are a lot of people who, while they hate the regime, are worried that if the regime were to be, if you were to confront the regime too sharply, that the Revolutionary Guards would start a civil war, a la the Syrian civil war, or what happened in Egypt, where the government was overthrown, and the new government that came in was, if anything, worse on human rights than the previous one, and eventually the military overthrew that new government.
Let's talk about human rights. Yeah, sorry, we can say more.
I was just going to say, look, it's a sad situation. The irony is that if there's any place where life has gotten freer in the last few years, it's in Saudi Arabia. Not politically freer, but culturally freer. There's a lot fewer restrictions on women, a lot fewer restrictions on young people, a lot fewer restrictions on entertainment. And so life in Saudi Arabia is entirely different than what it was 10 years ago.
Now let's talk a little bit about human rights and Israel. As you know, even on this campus, the New School campus, and across many campuses around the United States, there's been dramatic protests against the Israeli actions in Gaza and now in Lebanon that have killed tens of thousands of people. Seems not to have deflected the Netanyahu government from pursuing its goals here. Are human rights dead in the Middle East?
Well, the Israeli government is highly controversial at home, but the Israeli public is quite uninterested in the kind of issues that are being raised by the protesters here. So the big concern in Israel has been the release of hostages, and the protests about how we need a ceasefire now are protests about how we have to bring the hostages home. They're not about protests about how we have to have a better humanitarian situation for people in Gaza. That's an issue in which there's frankly extremely support among the Israeli public. And so we should understand that the very active protest movement in Israel in favor of the ceasefire is about the hostages. It's not about the humanitarian situation of Palestinians.
We've got some questions here, Patrick, that I want to bring in from the audience. First is Israel right to be worried that if Iran does develop a nuclear bomb, it would use it offensively against Israel simply to destroy Israel?
Well, the bigger concern about Iran having nuclear weapons is that they would feel freer to engage in all kinds of attacks against Israel, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's attacks by the Houthis on shipping going into Israel, which is effectively shut down Israel's access to the Indian and Pacific Oceans, or whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas attacks across the border. So it would have to be a pretty extreme scenario in which there was a nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran. And that's not really the most likely scenario. But the concern is that much as in the 1970s, nuclear-armed Soviet Union felt free to engage in lots of support for movements that the U.S. found offensive, whether it was in Nicaragua or Angola and the like, Afghanistan. That nuclear-armed Iran would feel that the nuclear weapons provide what the experts refer to as umbrella under which the Iranians can engage in offensive activities. And there would always be the risk that in some kind of confrontation that things could escalate and the Iranians could say to the Israelis, stop it or else we'll use nuclear weapons at least for a demonstration strike. And that the two sides can miscalculate. There could be something like
that. Yeah, this is a long question, so I'm going to read it because there've been lots of inside baseball here, I guess, in the conversation we've had. But I have a question. Had U.S. uncritical support for Israel become a liability for U.S. ambition to remain the hegemon in a unipolar world, Israel has been a reliable, here's a quote from Robert Kennedy Jr., permanent aircraft carrier in the Mideast. But now Israel is violating the same rules that we are accusing Putin of violating, annexing by military force, crimes against humanity, etc. Does this undermine our ideological credibility? Here's the end of the question. If the U.S. has been sidelined in the Middle East, as you argue, why not stop supporting an apartheid regime, not just through military aid like funding Iron Dome, but through our diplomatic cover?
Well, the U.S. support for the defense of Israel has got broad support here at home, and I can't see much stomach in Congress or among mainstream politicians for anti-U.S. support for Israel's defense. And I think that it's implausible to suggest that the United States is going to abandon a country that has been a close ally of the U.S. for a long time. And if the U.S. were to do that, then there were a lot of other close U.S. allies which would worry that, uh-oh, that could happen to us. And we could see countries, whether it's South Korea or that, for that matter, countries in Europe, feeling that they too have to develop nuclear weapons and have to develop capabilities that don't rely on the United States to come to their defense. And so there's a real geostrategic cost if you abandon a long-term ally. And I think that the United States has been quite successful at getting Israel to change its policies on the margins, not on basic issues. And that when the United States has overreached, it frankly has shot itself in the foot. So I think of, for instance, Barack Obama, his first day in the office, he appointed a special envoy for Middle East peace, George Mitchell, and said that Israeli settlements in the territories taken in 1967 were all illegal. Well, by doing that, what Mr. Obama did was to say that Israeli building in East Jerusalem was every bit as illegal as Israeli building the crazy isolated hilltops on the West Bank. And that was a policy that was opposed by better than 90% of Israeli Jews. And so that really undercut Obama's influence with the Israeli government. And Obama adopted a more limited policy of saying that Israel should rebuild east of the security barrier, better than 80% of Israeli Jews would have supported that, and Obama could have gotten it. But by having this overreach of saying, no, all Israeli construction, including East Jerusalem, is illegal, Obama undercut U.S. influence and empowered the crazy hilltop settlers who've always said that anybody who opposes our settlements is also going to oppose Israeli control over East Jerusalem. I think that the United States gets more when it's attuned to the political realities in countries it's dealing with. And certainly that's been the experience around the world. So if you take a look, for instance, at the European Union, which sometimes is very critical of U.S. support for Israel, well, the European Union has been utterly unsuccessful in solving a dispute in its own territory over Cyprus. The European Union has never been found a way in which it could press either the Greeks or the Turks to come to a deal there. And so I think they should have a little understanding that getting the Israelis and the Palestinians to come to a deal is also going to be kind of difficult.
Here's a question that in part goes to me, I guess. So it's why has there been no direct discussion of the horror and inhumanity of the Gaza operation and the active support by the U.S. Without this discussion, how can we understand human rights in the region? So let me put that more directly. How should we be thinking and talking about the Israeli actions in the Middle East, which, as I did say in an earlier question, has led to really some very strong reactions on campuses, calls for divestment and in companies that have funded the war effort and upset many people in this country, even if not the majority.
Well, I think on that front, the protesters in campuses and the Israeli public are talking past each other. And the Israeli focus has been on the horror of what happened on October 7th and the horror of the continuing holding of the hostages. And the Israeli public has frequently said, look, if you want to end the fighting in Gaza, it's quite simple. Hamas releases the hostages and that'll end the fighting. And so if you want to ask the question of why does the fighting go on, ask Hamas why they continue to hold the hostages. And if you want to talk about the horrors, let's discuss the horrors of October 7th. So that's a deeply held viewpoint on the part of the Israeli public. And it's going to be very difficult to change that. The U.S. government put quite a bit of effort into providing humanitarian aid to people in Gaza, and as I say, was really quite successful. Not things were very bad in the first 6 months, but got to be quite good in the spring and early summer. And then since the Israeli operation in Rafah, they deteriorated again badly. And I think the U.S. is going to press again to say, hey, look, you got to do something about this. But it's been very hard for the United States government to get the Israelis to think about the day after, and to think about what's going to happen in Gaza over the long term, and what are you going to do about the humanitarian situation in Gaza. It's just not been the Israeli priority.
Right, and I understand that from I can understand that from the Israeli perspective, and maybe that's how a country that's been attacked and brutally attacked responds and thinks only about the hostages or mainly about the hostages and not the harm to others. But that's the responsibility then of the international community, isn't it, to say, wait a minute, that's not an acceptable response, and we're going to take measures to more than just making sure. I mean, we have this weird situation of the U.S. supplying bombs to drop on Gaza. At the same time, we're talking about more humanitarian aid to Gaza to ameliorate the harm that our weapons and armaments have caused. Should there be, leaving aside the difficulty of persuading the Israeli public, should there be a broader movement in the international community to really condemn the actions happening in Gaza?
Well, it's the nature of war that there's going to be a lot of casualties and a lot of people killed. How do you stop the war? How do you stop a war in Ukraine? How do you stop the war in Gaza? It's going to be very difficult, to put it mildly, and you have to come up with rationales that are going to be persuasive to the parties concerned if you want to stop that war. This is not going to be easy as long as Hamas continues to hold those hostages. And of course, the Israelis have a real conviction that their critics' agenda actually is the elimination of the state of Israel. And they see this as a crystal knot moment as to who are their friends and who are not prepared to stand up to defend them. For Israel, every day is October 8th, the day after the October 7th assaults, and their critics do very little to address that kind of concern. And so the actions of their critics could not be better designed to persuade the Israeli government to ignore them.
There's one more question here to ask. Is there any chance that the Iran nuclear deal could be reinstated? What's your sense of that?
Well, it'd have to be a different deal, because Iran's nuclear program has moved on, and therefore the restrictions of the original deal are no longer relevant. And furthermore, I think that from the experience of the original deal, that this time the United States would insist that any kind of an agreement that loosens restrictions on Iran would have to cover missiles as well as nukes. It couldn't be just confined to the nuclear program. Could we get such a deal? It's going to be tough. I think it's unlikely while Khamenei is alive. But it was very interesting that Pezeshkian, the Iranian president of the UN General Assembly, was quite obviously interested in resuming negotiations about what a deal might look like. The U.S. would have to decide what's it prepared to put on the table as an offer to Iran. And at least so far, the U.S. hasn't been prepared to put very much on the table. So Iran hasn't seen a whole lot of reason to agree with you.
Should the U.S. be putting more on the table? What's your sense on how this?
Well, the United States needs to have some leverage with Iran. And I think that leverage has to include carrots as well as sticks. Frankly, we don't have any credible sticks and we don't have any credible carrots. And so we don't have leverage with it. It's going to be very difficult for a U.S. government to agree to relax restrictions in Iran while Iran's continuing to engage in terrorist activities, such as its continued attempts to kill former American officials. But the U.S. needs to figure out a way in which it can put together a package of carrots as well as sticks.
Patrick, we're getting close to the end. If I were Ezra Klein, I'd ask you what 3 books you've read recently and recommend. Not going to do that, although it wouldn't be inappropriate for an academic institution to end with that. But I'll ask you a different question: is how your experience at NSSR helped you prepare to work on the issues you're currently working on about the Middle East and U.S. policy in the region?
I would say an analytical eye. Instead of asking what I wish would be the case and how I wish the world would be operated, to learn about, to look at how do those concerned, how are they approaching the matter? What are they likely to do? Where are things likely to go? Not where I wish things would go, but where are they likely to go? When I studied at the New School, I was quite taken with Marxism. And while I've moved away from Marxism, I would simply say the claim to be scientific socialists had some real merit of saying, let's be scientific about how we approach matters that we care about deeply.
Patrick, thank you so much for being the lead-off speaker in our new series, NSSR Insights. We've recorded this and we'll post it on our website. It's been really interesting. I appreciate you sharing your expertise with us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, and thank you to the audience. And we'll see you soon again when we plan our next session. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks.